Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're taking a sip of something a little different, something you might not expect. We're diving deep into the world of wine fraud.
Wine fraud.
Yeah, wine fraud.
You mean like putting a fancy label on a cheap bottle?
Well, yeah, sometimes. But it actually goes way beyond that. We've got all these articles and case studies and even some insights from experts. And, well, let me tell you, this rabbit hole goes deep.
It's a world of, well, it's shadowy figures and elaborate schemes and, collectors are willing to pay a fortune, like a king's ransom, just for a taste of history.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Like, what is wine fraud exactly? I mean, I know it's about fake wine, obviously, but what are we talking about here?
Wine fraud is basically like intentional deception, right? It's about misrepresenting a wine, its authenticity, its origin, age, quality, all to inflate its value.
So it's like a counterfeit handbag or something.
Yeah.
But with a way bigger price tag.
Yeah, exactly. But often with a lot more finesse. We're talking about organized networks, skilled forgers, people who really understand the ins and outs of the wine market, how to exploit it.
So it's not just, I don't know, some guy in his basement filling up old bottles with, like, the cheapest wine he can find?
I mean, that does happen, but it's usually much more sophisticated.
I was reading that certain regions are particularly vulnerable to fraud. Why is that?
Well, it all comes down to, supply and demand. Certain regions like Bordeaux and Burgundy or, those cult wineries in California, they produce some of the most sought-after wines in the world, but there's just not enough of it to go around.
Okay, so high price tag, limited availability.
Yeah.
Makes it a target.
Exactly. And fraudsters are always looking to exploit those gaps between, what people want and what's actually available.
So what are some of the tricks of the trade? What are those fraudsters up to?
Oh, they've got a whole arsenal. One common tactic is refilling. They empty genuine bottles of, those prestigious wines and refill them with something way cheaper.
Oh, so you could have a bottle that looks like it's like 100 years old, but inside it's what, like a Pinot Grigio from last week?
Pretty much, yeah. And even some experienced drinkers, they might not be able to tell the difference.
Wow. Scary. What else? I read about mislabeling. What's that all about?
Mislabeling, that's another classic. Let's say you have a bottle that says it's from, like, a Grand Cru vineyard in Burgundy.
Fancy.
Right. But it's actually from, a less prestigious area.
Zeke.
They're just banking on people not being able to tell the difference or maybe just wanting to believe what they see on the label.
Right, because most people probably can't tell a Grand Cru's from anything else, right?
Exactly. And that's where the fraudsters thrive, on that, lack of knowledge. Or sometimes, sometimes people just want to believe what they want to believe.
Okay, then there's the classic move, faking the vintage. Slap a label on there saying it's from some legendary year, and suddenly you've got collectors drooling.
This one's all about rarity, right? Older vintages, especially those known for, exceptional quality, they command much higher prices. The problem is, verifying the age of a wine can be tricky. Really tricky.
So how do they pull it off? I mean, wasn't the wine itself give it away?
It can be difficult, but skilled fraudsters, they've figured out ways to manipulate a wine's appearance and taste to make it seem older than it is.
Wait, so they can, like, make a young wine taste old? How is that even possible?
It's not, it's not magic or anything. It's about understanding the chemistry of wine, how it ages. They might use things like microoxygenation to speed up the aging process or add compounds to mimic the flavors of an older wine.
That's wild. But faking a vintage is one thing. What about creating an entirely counterfeit bottle? That seems like a whole other level, like criminal mastermind stuff.
It is, and that's where we get to figures like Rudy Kurniawan.
Rudy Kurniawan. Yeah, I read about him. He wasn't just refilling bottles. He was basically running a wine counterfeiting factory.
That's one way to put it. His operation was meticulous. Fake labels, old bottles. He even blended wines to match the taste profiles of rare and expensive vintages.
So he was, like, creating the perfect fakes.
He had an incredible palate and a deep understanding of what made those wines so desirable. And he used that knowledge to create counterfeits that could fool even the most experienced expert.
And he was selling those fakes at high-profile auctions, making millions. How did he get away with it for so long?
He exploited gaps in provenance documentation. Basically, he took advantage of the trust placed in experts and the allure of those rare wines. He created a whole backstory, built relationships with collectors. He was really good at playing the role of the passionate connoisseur.
So it was all about the showmanship. as much as the wine.
Absolutely. He knew how the market worked, how to appeal to collectors' desires, for exclusivity, prestige, and that thrill of owning something rare.
But it all came crashing down, didn't it?
It did. In 2012, he was arrested, sentenced to 10 years in prison, one of the biggest convictions for wine fraud ever.
Wow, that's crazy. It's like something out of a movie. But it makes you wonder, if someone like Kurniawan could pull this off, for so long, what else is out there? What else is slipping through the cracks?
That's the unsettling part of wine fraud. It's a global problem that affects everyone. It's not just about money, it's about trust. It tarnishes the reputation of the entire industry.
Speaking of high-profile cases, our sources also mentioned some pretty daring heists, like those in the California wine auction in 2018 and the Mayfair wine auction a year later. I always thought those auctions were like Fort Knox, super secure.
They have a lot of security, yes, but even the most prestigious events can be vulnerable.
Right.
Those cases show how valuable wine has become, makes it a target for thieves looking to make a quick buck on the black market.
So it's not just fake bottles, it's stolen ones too. I'm starting to feel like I needed a detective's badge just to buy a bottle of wine. So let's say you've got a bottle in front of you. How can you tell if it's the real deal? Or how can the experts tell? Is there like some kind of wine CSI unit?
There is a kind of forensic approach, yeah. Experts look at the label, the capsule, the bottle itself, looking for anything that seems off.
I'm picturing someone with a magnifying glass, like scrutinizing the label for a misplaced comma.
It can be that detailed. They analyze the printing, the paper, the ink. They even look at the typography, trying to spot those tiny variations that separate a real label from a fake.
So it's like art authentication, but with wine labels.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just looking at it. There's also the science. Things like spectrometry and chromatography, which analyze the wine's chemical composition.
Wait, so they're like fingerprinting the wine?
Basically, yeah. They're looking for specific compounds that help identify the grape, the region, even the vintage. They can tell if there have been any additives or, manipulations that might point to fraud.
Wow, that's incredible. And I read about this thing called carbon dating. Is that actually used for wine?
It is. Carbon dating can be used to determine the age of the cork or other materials from the bottle. Helps to verify that vintage. It's not a perfect method, but it can provide valuable clues.
Okay, so that's for verifying the wine itself.
Yeah.
But what about the bottle's history? Where it's been all this time. How do you track that?
That's where provenance comes in. Verifying the ownership history is key to establishing authenticity. It involves researching auction records, import and export documents, even old cellar logs, anything that can create a clear chain of custody.
So it's like you're piecing together a puzzle, but with wine bottles instead of, cardboard pieces.
Yeah, you could say that. And it can be a painstaking process, lots of dead ends and missing pieces. But for high-value wines, it's essential. Luckily, technology is starting to help.
Right, that's where blockchain comes in. I read that it's being used to create a digital trail for each bottle. But how does that actually work?
Imagine a digital ledger that tracks every step of the wine's journey, from the vineyard all the way to the consumer. Every transaction, every change of ownership, it's all recorded. It creates this tamper-proof history.
So it's like a permanent record. You can't fake it, you can't change it. But wouldn't that require, everyone to be on board with this system? Every winery, every cellar?
It does require widespread adoption, but the potential benefits are huge. Increased transparency, reduced fraud. It could even empower consumers to make more informed decisions.
This is all pretty intense. I feel like I need a PhD just to buy a bottle of wine these days. What's the average wine lover supposed to do?
You don't need a PhD to protect yourself. There are simple things you can do.
Why?
The most important is to buy from reputable sources, established wine merchants, trusted auction houses.
Yeah.
People with a track record.
Because they're not like the guy selling wine out of his van at the flea market.
Probably not, no.
But how can you tell if a source is reputable?
Do your research. Look for expertise, professionalism. Have they been around for a while? Are they members of any professional organizations? Do they have good reviews? A little digging online can go a long way.
That's good advice. And I read about those authentication services. Are those worth looking into?
Absolutely, especially for big purchases. They specialize in verifying authenticity. They've got the labs, the experts, the resources to do a deep dive on a bottle. It's peace of mind, especially for those big investments.
So if you're dropping serious cash, maybe get a second opinion from the wine detectives.
Exactly. They can examine everything, the bottle, the wine itself, research the provenance, give you a professional assessment.
Okay, so reputable sources, authentication services. Anything else? Any other tips for the average wine lover who doesn't want to get scammed?
Always inspect the bottle carefully before you buy. Look at the label, the capsule, how full is the bottle. Anything seem off? Does the label look too new for how old the wine is supposed to be?
So channel your inner detective. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
Exactly. Trust your instincts. And don't be afraid to ask questions. A good seller will be happy to give you more information about the wine, its history, and any documentation they have.
This is all great advice. I'm definitely going to be checking my bottles a lot more closely from now on. We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this whole world.
Well, we've laid the foundation, and now it's time to, well, it's time to go deeper. We need to look at the consequences of wine fraud and how this is shaping the future of the industry.
We've talked about how these wine fraudsters operate, but what about the fallout? Like, what happens when someone gets caught selling fake bottles? Is it a big deal?
It's a huge deal.
Holy.
Wine fraud is, well, it's a serious crime.
Huh.
There are major legal consequences. We're talking jail time, big fines, and even, they might even have to pay back the people they ripped off.
So it's not just a slap on the wrist, like, don't do it again.
No, not at all. The legal system, it takes wine fraud very seriously, especially because we're talking about a market where a single bottle can be worth a ton of money, more than some people's cars.
Right. And, I mean, wouldn't there also be lawsuits? Like, from the buyers who got tricked?
Absolutely. If you buy a bottle thinking it's, this rare vintage, and you shell out thousands of dollars for it, and then you find out it's a fake, yeah, you're going to be pretty upset.
Or would he?
And you can sue for damages, try to get your money back. And it's not just the fraudsters themselves who can be held responsible. It could be wine sellers, auction houses, even wineries if they were involved in selling or distributing those fake wines.
Well, so there's like this ripple effect. Everybody's on the hook.
Yeah, the stakes are high for everyone.
And what about reputation? I mean, the world of wine is all about trust, right?
Reputation is everything in this industry. Once that trust is broken, well, it's tough to rebuild it. For wineries, for merchants, auction houses, their reputation is, well, it's their most valuable asset.
Yeah, I bet.
Word gets around fast in the wine community.
Oh, for sure. If someone finds out they got scammed, they can tell our friends, don't buy from that guy.
Exactly. Bad publicity can be a disaster. You can lose clients, market share. It can take a long time to regain that credibility. It's a risk that no one wants to take.
So it's not just about, like, the individual transaction. It can affect the whole industry, right?
It can.
Like, if people start to worry that everything's fake, they're going to be less likely to buy wine, to collect it, to invest in it.
That's the danger. When fraud becomes widespread, it undermines the entire market. People become hesitant, they lose confidence. And that can even affect the value of authentic wines.
It's like this vicious cycle. More fraud, less trust, and then it becomes harder for the, legitimate businesses to operate. So what about the future? Is there any way to really combat wine fraud? Or are we just stuck in this endless game of cat and mouse?
That's the million-dollar question. I think the key is, it's a multi-pronged approach. We've already talked about some of the tools, the scientific analysis, provenance verification, the blockchain technology. Those are all important, but they're just a piece of the puzzle.
Right, because technology is great, but, someone still has to use it.
Exactly. Someone has to interpret the data, make sure the system isn't being manipulated.
So what else needs to happen?
I think we need more awareness, more education, and, more collaboration across the entire industry.
What do you mean?
Well, wineries need to, really tighten up their security, make it harder to steal wine and to fake their bottles. And merchants need to be much more careful about where they get their wines from. They have to vet their sources.
They accept that.
And consumers, they need to be educated. They need to know about the risks, know how to protect themselves.
So it's like a team effort.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility, From the vineyards to the auction houses, all the way to the person buying a bottle for their dinner party.
Okay, but let's be real. This is all pretty complicated stuff. I like wine, but I'm no expert. What can the average person really do to avoid getting scammed?
You don't need to be an expert to make good choices.
So what should we do?
The first thing is to educate yourself. Learn about the wines you enjoy, the regions, the producers, the vintages. The more you know, the easier it is to spot those red flags.
So it's like, do your homework.
Yeah.
Don't just buy a bottle because it looks fancy or it's expensive.
Exactly. And if you're not sure about something, ask questions. Ask a wine merchant you trust, or consult some reputable resources.
Like anything else, right? The more you know, the better decisions you can make.
Right.
But I'm curious, why do you think people are so quick to believe a bottle is worth, like, a small fortune? Even when, well, even when there might be some signs that it's not.
That's a great question. I think it has to do with the allure of wine, especially fine wine. It's
Yeah.
not just a drink, it's an experience, a status symbol. It's a connection to history, to tradition.
So it's about the story behind it.
Exactly. And fraudsters, they understand that. They prey on those desires. They know that people want to own something rare, something exclusive.
So they're selling a fantasy.
Yeah.
And some people are willing to pay a lot of money for it.
That's right. And they might even ignore some of those warning signs because they want to believe it's true.
But what about the experts? Surely they can spot a fake,
Right.
right? I mean, they have trained palates, years of experience.
Even experts can be fooled, especially when you're talking about really sophisticated forgeries. Remember Rudy Kurniawan?
Yeah.
He managed to deceive some of the top wine experts in the world. He was that good.
It's a good reminder that even the experts can make mistakes. And there's so much misinformation out there. With all these online marketplaces and social media, it's easy to spread rumors and fake information about wine.
It's a big problem. It's hard to know who to trust. You've got all these bloggers, influencers, all these self-proclaimed experts giving their opinions. And sometimes they're promoting wines that are, well, let's just say they're questionable.
So how do we navigate all of that? How do we know what to believe?
You have to be a critical thinker. Don't just believe everything you read. Look at the source. Look for evidence. And if something sounds too good to be true, well, it probably is.
So it's like being a detective.
It is. But instead of, looking for fingerprints, you're looking at wine labels, auction records, online reviews.
And if you're not sure, consult a real expert.
Absolutely. There are plenty of reputable sources out there, wine critics, journalists, historians, organizations like the Wine and Spirit Education Trust.
So it takes some work,
It does.
but it's worth it, right?
Absolutely. Wine is something to enjoy. And that enjoyment is even better when you know you're drinking an authentic wine, something that represents, the real artistry of the winemaker.
Well said. We've
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground here. But there's one question I keep coming back to. If wine fraud is so common, does it actually change how we think about certain wines? Like, does it affect their value, their prestige?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, does knowing that fakes exist make us appreciate the real wines more? Or does it kind of, I don't know, taint them? It's something to think about.
Yeah, it's almost like a philosophical question. Does authenticity become more valuable when you know there are people out there trying to fake it?
Mm,
I'm not sure.
I don't know either.
Well, we've talked about a lot of these high-profile cases,
Mm.
but is there one that really stands out to you, like the most audacious or elaborate?
One that always comes to mind is it's called the Jefferson Bottles hoax.
Jefferson bottles.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
It involved a collection of wines that supposedly belonged to, well, Thomas Jefferson,
Thomas Jefferson.
the third president in the United States,
Oh,
and a big wine lover.
okay.
These bottles, they had his initials etched on them. They were dated to the late 1700s. They surfaced in the 1980s, and, well, they caused a huge sensation.
I bet wines from Thomas Jefferson. That's incredible. But there was a catch, right?
There is. The bottles were fakes, really elaborate fakes. They were created by a German wine counterfeiter, Hardy Rodenstock. He was great at telling these convincing stories. He'd find old bottles and then make them look centuries old.
Wait, so he faked wines that were supposedly from like the 1700s.
He did.
How is that even possible?
He was a master. He found old bottles at flea markets and antique shops. He'd etch them, with fake markings, and then he'd fill them with these special blends of wine that were designed to, well, to taste like they were from that era.
So he was like recreating history, but with wine instead of, I don't know, costumes and stuff.
Yeah, something like that. And his creations, they fooled a lot of experts, people who should have known better.
So what happened to the Jefferson bottles?
Well, eventually they were exposed. After a lot of investigation and scientific analysis, the whole thing was a big scandal. It really shook the wine world because it raised questions about authenticity, about expertise.
It's a good reminder that even in a world with all this, technology and experts, deception can still happen,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it plays on, our fascination with history.
It's a cautionary tale. It reminds us to be careful to verify things, to not believe everything we hear.
Well said. We've learned a lot about the shady side of the wine world, but I don't want anyone to walk away from this feeling like they can't enjoy a nice glass of wine anymore.
Right. It's about being informed, not being afraid.
Exactly. So before we wrap things up, let's do a little recap just to make sure everyone's got the tools they need to, navigate this whole thing. First off, remember how big this problem actually is? It's a global operation.
A global operation worth billions.
Billions. And it's not just those super rare, expensive bottles being targeted. Even those everyday wines, the ones most people buy, they could be faked too.
That's a really important point. We hear about those big cases with, bottles worth tens of thousands of dollars. But, well, fraud can happen at any level.
Right. So even if you're not like a serious collector, you still need to be aware of this. And speaking of being aware, provenance, that's key. It's like a wine's like a family tree, right?
Exactly. It shows you where the wine's been, who's owned it. That chain of custody is so important, especially when you're spending a lot of money.
Right, because you wouldn't buy a used car without checking its history, right?
That's a great analogy. Provenance is like a car's history report, but for wine.
And the good news is technology is making it easier to track all of this. Blockchain, that's really changing the game.
It is. It's like a digital fingerprint for each bottle. Every step of the way, from the vineyard to, your wine glass, it's all recorded. You can't change it. You can't fake it.
Okay, but let's be real. Most people aren't going to be, running blockchain checks every time they buy a bottle of wine. What can we actually do in everyday life?
The first rule is always buy from a reputable source.
Okay, so like your local wine shop, a store you trust.
Yeah, or an established online retailer. Look for a place that's been around for a while. Maybe they're members of some, professional organizations.
So I'm guessing like buying wine from, I don't know, a random guy on the internet, probably not the best idea.
Probably not. And if you're ever unsure, those authentication services can be really helpful. They're like, they're like wine detectives.
Yeah, the wine detectives. We talked about those earlier.
They have the tools and the knowledge to really investigate a bottle. So if you're spending a lot of money or if you just, have any doubts about a bottle, it's worth getting that second opinion.
And honestly, the best advice I've heard is just to be curious, to ask questions. Don't be afraid to, do a little digging. Especially if something seems too good to be true, it probably is.
That's so important. Don't let a fancy label or a low price cloud your judgment. Ask the seller about the wine. Where's it from? What's the story behind it? Do they have any documentation?
Right, because if they're legitimate, they should be able to answer your questions. Well, this has been quite a journey, a deep dive into a world I never knew existed. We've talked about the different ways fraud happens, the consequences, and most importantly, how to protect ourselves. But before we go, I have one last question. What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about wine fraud?
I think a lot of people assume that it only affects, the wealthy collectors, the ones who are buying those super rare, expensive bottles. But that's just not true.
Yeah.
Fraud happens at every level. I mean, there are people counterfeiting those everyday wines, the ones that cost, $15, $20.
Really? Wow. You'd think it wouldn't be worth it to fake those cheaper bottles.
You would, but those are actually more vulnerable in a way because people aren't as cautious.
That's true. You don't really think about someone faking like a $10 bottle of wine, do you?
You don't. But for a fraudster, if they can make that bottle for, a few dollars and sell it for 10, it adds up, especially if they're making a lot of them.
It's a numbers game. The cheaper the wine, the more they have to sell to make a profit.
Are there certain types of wines that are, more likely to be faked at those lower price points?
Usually it's those popular wines, the ones you see everywhere, the ones with, a really recognizable brand. Because it's easier to pass off a fake if people are already familiar with the label.
That's interesting. I would thought it would be the opposite, that it would be those, super rare, expensive bottles that would be the most tempting to fake.
Those are definitely targets, but it takes a lot more skill and resources to fake those. You need old bottles, you need specialized equipment, you need a deep understanding of wine, of chemistry. But with those cheaper wines, it's more about just creating a decent imitation, something that can fool the average consumer.
So it's about catching people when they're not paying attention, like when they're just grabbing a bottle for dinner. That's right. And that's why it's so important to be vigilant. Even when you're buying a bottle for, $10, $15, check the label, the capsule, make sure everything looks right. And if something feels off, just don't buy it.
Trust your gut. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I mean, I've learned so much. It's a whole world I never knew existed. But what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
Be curious. Ask questions. Wine is meant to be enjoyed. But that enjoyment, well, it's so much better when you know that what you're drinking is authentic. When you know it represents, the real work of the winemaker.
I couldn't agree more. And that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and, well, keep those detective hats on.